So, remember how we were talking yesterday about the importance of meeting people in real life and human connectedness? I'm very pleased to welcome now my co-chair, Francesca Pick, that is going to interview Jennifer Billock, the CEO of Couchsurfing, and Arun Sundarajan. Please, Fran, have a seat. They're going to talk about the sharing economy and human connectedness. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to have with me here today, as Asma said, Arun and Jennifer. Arun is professor at NYU Stern School of Business, and he's done a lot of research on digital economies and how information technology is impacting business and society. And actually, he's one of the first professors who's really been doing a lot of great research on the sharing economy, trying to bring facts behind everything that we're being able to observe. And actually, I met him 2 years ago. He almost came to the first OuiShare Fest, but there were some visa issues, and so unfortunately that didn't end up working. But this is now the second time he's here, so I'm happy that we can continue discussing. And with me here is also Jennifer, the CEO of Couchsurfing. And so just to kick off this round, before going into the topic of the sharing economy and human connectedness, maybe each of you can just say a few words about like how did you end up in the sharing economy, researching it or working in it, and what is it that drew you to the subject? Arun?
Well, it's really awesome to be back here. I think that this is a space like no other and a community like no other, and so I'm delighted to be here. You know, I started researching the sharing economy because I was interested in trust, what causes people to trust each other, and my hope was that we would, you know, increase the ways in which we could sort of exchange things with other people in an economic context because of sites like Facebook emerging that were digitizing social capital. My guess is that it probably would have been a passing phase, but then I found OuiShare, and you guys sort of really drew me in, and there was no turning back after that, and so that's why I continue to research the sharing economy.
Good morning. See, I could answer that a few different ways. I came to Couchsurfing, and thus the sharing economy, as it is occasionally called, really because of my background in consumer internet technology. But I stayed at Couchsurfing, and I fell in love with it, really, because I find it a profound honor to be able to work in a place and with a community that is really about a very intimate kind of connection that I just find quite moving. And it's, I think, somewhat rare in the technology industry to really feel the way that I feel about what I do every day. So I feel extremely fortunate to be part of this whole situation, and of Couchsurfing in particular.
Yeah, so that actually already brings us to the topic that we defined for the session today. And so when we talk about human connectedness, basically ever since the sharing collaborative economy has emerged, one of the main arguments that people always bring up, apart from the economic benefits, is the social benefits. So for instance, many of these platforms enable people to get more in touch with their neighbors, right? So meal sharing platforms, or if you're using Couchsurfing or a peer-to-peer rental, you're able to meet people locally. So these social benefits are really something that are discussed a lot, and I think used as a really important argument for why this is a great new innovation. But I think that there's a lack of data and information on, is this really happening? And also, as we were saying, technology does seem to often isolate in a way, and we're using apps to connect ourselves with our neighbors when we used to maybe actually just be in touch with them anyway. So maybe, Arun, you can say a little bit about the historical development, technology, what effect has that had in the past on people being isolated or more connected?
Okay, well, yeah, see, yeah, I think a really important part of what will sustain, these emerging sharing economies, these forms of exchange that we're starting to sort of make part of our lives at scale, are the connections that we start to form with the people who we exchange with. And, in some ways, to me, that's one of the most compelling dimensions of the sharing economy, because if you go back, I'm a professor, so I'm going to give you a little history lesson here. If you go back 150 years, maybe not all the way back to Marx, but certainly to Durkheim and the late 19th century, and his observation that, that economic development and technological progress was isolating people from their communities. It was causing this sort of fragmentation of the individual from the community group. And you fast forward to the 1950s, and you see a similar message coming from the work of Robert Nisbet, who, again, was talking about the isolating effects of economic development. And all the way to, over the last 10 years, Sherry Turkle from MIT has written, this wonderful series of books that talks about the isolating sort of effects of digital technologies, how digital technologies create these ties to other people that are not emotive, that somehow we are tethered to other people without having sort of rich, high bandwidth interactions. And so, I'm fascinated by, I guess by platforms like Meetup. You just heard from Scott, because Meetup is an example of creating purpose-driven community dynamically, right? I mean, you don't necessarily have to, connect with your church group or your Rotary Club or a particular sort of well-defined community group. You are dynamically creating community as a natural byproduct of living your life, of your interest in something. And it's the same thing with a lot of sharing activities, right? These aren't platforms that are saying, come to me because I'll give you a way to connect with other people. These are platforms that are saying, or sort of ways of exchange that are saying that I'll help you find a place to stay, I'll help you get transportation, I'll help you get food, I'll help you get money. But as a byproduct, you are also sort of changing as a human being. In some sense, when you get past that point where you can trust someone enough to lend them money, to sort of give them your spare bedroom, to let them sleep on your couch, to sit in the front seat with you when you're sort of taking a ride, to sit at your dining table and have a meal, you cross a barrier that sort of gets you more connected with human beings in general, because in a sense, you're sort of getting some practice for what it's like to have sort of a high bandwidth emotive connection, and you're doing it as a byproduct of getting something that you need rather than as a dedicated activity. Oh, I have to connect with other people.
But so you're saying that maybe the sharing economy is an exception in this, that technology is actually leading to more connection.
Absolutely. I mean, I see, it's possible that in the 1950s, there was a group like ours that sort of had found pockets of technological development that were leading to greater connectedness, and that felt that they had found evidence that ran counter to sort of the narrative of the last 100 years. But, I've looked for it and I haven't been able to find it. So I'm fascinated by the prospect that we may have reached this inflection point where rather than taking us further apart, technological progress might actually in some ways bring us close together. And we can't sort of take this for granted. I mean, this isn't sort of a done deal, because you've got sites like Instacart as well in the United States that frees you from the hassle of having to go to the grocery store. So you don't actually interact with another human being when you're getting your groceries. You can sit at home and order it, and someone will shop for you and bring it for you. On the other side, you have La Ruche de Vie, the food assembly in France, where it's making grocery shopping a much more community-based activity. You order online, but you gather in this warehouse and you sort of interact with each other as you're doing that activity. So which one will dominate, the Instacart narrative or the food assembly narrative? We don't know yet, but there's certainly sort of promise here.
Okay, but so since this is pretty new, I guess we don't have that much data yet to really prove that this is happening. But from your experience in couch surfing, and I mean, it's been around for a long time, and I think the platform has evolved quite a bit. Do you feel there's some kind of proof or just experience that shows that this reconnection is really happening?
So I guess I would say that with social and sharing economy platforms in general, it's our choice, and it's sometimes a difficult choice because we're humans and we fall into habitual patterns of tapping on things and looking down at our phone instead of up at our neighbors. But so I would say that as a general statement, and I think it's up to us collectively to remember to stay connected to each other and to get up in the morning and remember that that love is a powerful force and that connection is a powerful force, and that those are the things that actually make us happy and have some promise for the future and our future generations. One of the things I love about couchsurfing is it really is about creating offline connection. And in the early days, certainly there weren't the technical capacities that there are now to sort of stay as tethered to your device. So it's very much in its roots to get you offline when being online was not as compelling when it started, certainly. I think there's a little quote here that I want to read, and I can put this into my own words, but the words of a couch surfer seem to sum up how I feel about it and what I hear people say a lot, which is that it really creates a kind of intimacy with strangers and establishes a notion of a world as a friendly place. So one of the things we say about couchsurfing is that you have friends all over the world. And I like to hold that just as a notion, because I think that that is an incredibly powerful notion for a number of reasons, and a desperately needed notion. And I say that not as a software developer or a developer of a platform for connecting people, but as a human being and as a parent. So this is a quote by a woman. Her name's Clara Benson, and she has a forthcoming book in which couchsurfing is featured. It's called No Baggage. And it's a little, she says, "This is the odd intimacy of couchsurfing, a digital tribe that encourages floating in and out of strangers' lives, occasionally in underwear. To invite a stranger into your most private space is a radical act of trust, one that tends to compress traditional relationship arcs into an ultra-concentrated couple-day span." And that's really the thing that I love about couchsurfing. There's a tremendous, tremendous intimacy in waking up with a stranger in your pajamas. And the types of conversations that I have had with the people I've hosted on couchsurfing, and the people who've been kind enough to host me, and the people who've come into our offices and talked about the way it's transformed or changed their lives, or transformed or changed their experience of the world or of another culture, are really, really profound. It's difficult almost for me to put into words. But I think that again, it's really up to us to remember how we carry ourselves through the world and how we interact with each other, both online and off. And I think that online platforms have a tremendous amount of potential for us to support one another and feel less alone, but it can tip, certainly, into an isolation where you speak less to your 80-year-old neighbor because he's not on Facebook. And,
in some sense, I mean, that's a really awesome quote, because to me it raises, there are at least three things, the prospect of three things that sort of come out of it. One is just simply there is a certain sort of intimacy from sharing your space and from sharing someone else's space. If you become a couchsurfing sort of provider, if you become an Airbnb provider, the very act of opening your home to a stranger. I've spoken to a number of people at Airbnb about this, and it seems like, that a common narrative seems to be that it changes who you are. right? And as a guest as well, as you are sort of, you're interacting with a person's life, even if you're not being sort of hosted with them, sort of co-located with you, you're interacting with sort of details of their life that are intimate. And in some sense, that sort of changes you as a person. And so there is sort of this intimacy and the same thing, like, sharing a seat in someone's car, sharing a sort of a spot at someone's dining table. I think my hope is that, like, this will cause a shift in how we sort of view the world. And the second point that leads to is really, this could potentially, this kind of interaction, that you describe on Couchsurfing, right? Of, some of the benefits accrue from that particular interaction, right? The interaction between the person whose couch it is and the person sleeping on the couch, right? But I think it also changes our attitude towards connecting with other people in general. And there's been a lot of evidence over the last decade that, a number of the United States and a number of countries in Western Europe are facing this crisis of connection. Loneliness is almost has reached epidemic proportions. There's a lot of research in the last few years that has shown that we feel social pain in the same way that we feel physical pain. Like, neurologically, the lack of sufficient connection to other human beings causes the neuroreceptors to light up in a way that is similar to when you are inflicted with physical pain. But we don't know how to overcome this. And so I think the act of interacting with people, through sites like Couchsurfing, in this in the sharing economy, is going to open us up to more fulfilling. In some sense, it trains us how to be better human beings in terms of connecting with other human beings. It potentially raises our levels of trust. And the third point is just simply that I hope that, as these behaviors scale, that we're able to preserve those intimacies, because sometimes when things get big, they start to get less personal.
That's exactly one of the points I think that's really critical. So is if we look at the platforms that are very successful today, especially Airbnb, for instance, that are really trying to focus on the transaction and the standardization of the experience, I think I see a real tension there between trying to grow, staying true to the mission, and often seeing that in this growth, the many standardizations are introduced and possibly the room for the social interaction decreases. And so I don't know how you feel about it, whether this is a necessary development. Do we need to be mainstream? Do we need these processes to become more standardized, to have more trust and make people really be able to feel like, I'm sure that this is going to be the exact service that I expected? Or is there really room for both of them when you get larger?
So this is a question that I take a lot from Couchsurfing community members or people who are sort of concerned about the preservation of the ethos. And what I generally say is, so I guess I want to start by making a little bit of a distinction between Couchsurfing and Airbnb, both of which I love. But if you go onto Airbnb, you see photographs of places primarily, and when you go onto Couchsurfing, you see photographs of people primarily. So that's kind of one way I think about the fundamental difference, is that when you're using Couchsurfing, you really are signing up to meet people, whether it's through staying with them or going to a Couchsurfing event, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a different value proposition. I think that, the idealist in me wants to believe, and does fundamentally believe, that the more people we can share these things with and these ways of interacting, the better the world will be, right? So you can go on to Couchsurfing or Uber or whatever. You can have a great experience. You can go onto the same site a different day and have a not so great experience. That's just kind of the way life is. I think that with a service like Couchsurfing, it it is important to evolve it technically and evolve it in the way that the market needs it to be evolved, which is generally people like instant gratification and they want things to be easier. And there is a need, I think, to introduce the right amount of friction into the type of interaction that you're creating. So I want a little bit of friction when I'm putting you in my house, or I'm putting myself in your house. But I may want less friction when I'm going on a bike ride. So I think it's possible. I think there, like many things in life, there are sometimes conflicting interests. And as leaders, we have a responsibility to hold a lot. To hold what's important to us, to hold what's important to our stakeholders and shareholders and our communities. And that's a responsibility to take pretty seriously. But I wouldn't say that I necessarily believe everything gets diluted and worse as it gets larger. At least I hope not, because I think we'd be kind of in trouble if that's the case.
I mean, it's...
Just one note, because you mentioned instant gratification. I think if we look at many of the success stories, it seems people really care about the economic value and the transactions. So I mean, many of the studies also that I've seen, also in Germany and many of the different marketplaces I've spoken to, people just want the good as fast as possible or the transaction. I mean, Uber is also an example of that. So I mean, can we really expect people to take on this responsibility of caring about a bit in the other direction?
Well, so, you know, I'm not sure that in the long run we're going to see that. Well, I'd be very surprised if we see this bifurcation between product quality and human connection. I mean, certainly immediacy is a good thing, and when you commoditize something, when you make it standard, it becomes easier to establish trust, and so it becomes easier to scale. If you preserve the variety and sort of the quality of human interaction, you end up with a better product, and in the long run, I think that will keep people coming